Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're talking about chapter 17, post-war European art, and how the artistic landscape is forever changed, altered, and affected by World War I, World War II in Europe. This is the last chapter before our next test, test number 2, which covers chapters 11, 12, 13 through 17. I'll put a bit of a study guide up. Remember, it is open note. Be thorough on the essay questions. The rest are either short answer, multiple choice, true or false. And good luck. You know more than you think you do. So today we're talking about the philosophy, even though there maybe wasn't a really unified aesthetic with artists, or even a lot of isms. Like, it seems like up to this point it's a lot of isms, right? Like surrealism, Dadaism, post-impressionism. There isn't as many isms. I think that's intentional. There was a sort of splintering and a sense of dislocation after the war, literally in Europe, because many people were either ousted from their homelands or chose to leave their homelands. So there isn't as much a sense of unified artistic movements or even aesthetic aims. But there are some philosophical things that link, and a new way of seeing and a new way of making, which we'll talk about today. These are the questions. The first thing that we're going to talk about is existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophy made famous by the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre was interested in studying how we exist, quite simply. I exist, you exist, we exist. But what does that mean mentally? What does that mean in terms of our thinking? Quite simply put, as existentialism at its root is a question of what does it mean to exist? It is the problem of being. It is the meaning of being. So you can imagine after the war, as a lot of people are questioning their faith, whether they're Jewish, Christian, because of the actions of Hitler, because of the spread of fascism, Nazism. It's a really time of questioning and turmoil. And so existentialism as a branch of thinking and philosophy really tries to make sense of that chaos. And in a way, it's a return to reason. And we will see that in the work today, a return to reason. And even though surrealist artists continue to make work, in the 1940s, 1950s, it shifts, and there isn't as much of this kind of like leisure idea in art. There's not as much of an emphasis on dreams or interpretations of dreams. It's more of dealing with the grittiness and the reality of the war, either in a very negative way, like in this piece by Picasso, as in showing the brutality of war. This is a family in Paris that was murdered as a result of the war in World War II, the Charnel House. And so in it, you can see dealing with that sense of the negative in the war. Then you have the opposite kind of philosophical response, those artists that wanted to kind of have escapism. So we'll kind of see two branches, but also a return to traditional, or rather, let me correct that, a return to traditions without it being traditional, right? So it's like taking tradition, breaking convention, and doing something new with it. Well, where do we see that with the work of Picasso? He never truly abandons tradition. We can see in the Charnel House here, even though this is a murder, wow, look, it looks a lot like Guernica, right? There is some twisting, distorting of bodies. Gone, though, is that really classical triangle that he used. This is much more of a chaotic of a scene. You really have to untangle and unpack what's going on and where the bodies start and stop. They become almost one intertwined mass. This is a family that's been murdered, a child, a mother, a father here, and they're reaching out in agony and pain, similar to that horse and that dead soldier that we saw in Guernica, but a much more personal reflection of tragedy and conflict as opposed to a universal feeling in Guernica of what war does. This is, instead of what war does to our collective us, it's what the war did to him or to a family, personalizing it. How is this tradition? Well, we can see there's a still life, there's portraits, even a bit of a sense of the landscape in the background where perhaps this tablecloth turns into a bit of a flame, buildings on fire. I swear that phone never rings unless I'm giving a lecture, and then the phone rings. Time for me to take a sip of water. But how is it not traditional, even though it's built on tradition? I would say the lack of color. It's monochromatic, just like Guernica. It also doesn't seem finished. To me, it seems done, but it doesn't seem like he finished it, right? Like there's parts that are unfinished, that are sketchy in this. And this is oil and charcoal on canvas. Typically, we think about charcoal as being used as an underdrawing, but here it's the final piece as well. So it's kind of like a before and after wrapped into one. So it's a response to the destruction. We talked about Alberto Giacometti in the last chapter as being a surrealist artist. Think about Giacometti, he's an Italian artist. He struggled with the results of the war, World War II. We think about the Italian influence or the Italian part as a player in the world scene for World War II, the rise of fascism, Mussolini connected to Hitler. And if you know the history, it's a really interesting history about Italy as sort of being a fair-weathered friend. I think they saw what was happening with Germany and aligned themselves with power, and then later said, oh yeah, we were never really part of that, as they saw that Germany was going to lose the war. It's an interesting thinking about where you are, right? As if you're a German post-World War II, how do you relate to the war that you just lost? You know, it's interesting, if you've ever been to Germany, they say that more sections of the Berlin Wall actually exist in the United States than do in Germany, because they're not proud of that history, right? And for us in the United States, we say, oh, maybe we shouldn't build walls, right, to separate us. And so they're a reminder of the Berlin Wall. I've seen it in Detroit, Washington, D.C. There's sections in museums, graffitied. But in Germany, they actually describe now, if you go to a lot of memorials or museums that are interested in the history of World War II, oftentimes Germans will explain the rise of Nazism as a foreign occupation, as if it didn't really, it was not really Germans do it. It's really interesting. They'll refer to that period as the period of occupation, being occupied by Hitler, as if it was some outside force and they had nothing to do with it. Similar to Italy, it's like returning to the tradition of the Republic of, at different times, Italians look back at imperial Rome and the idea of dictator for life. Emperor means dictator for life. And other times they look back to the Roman Republic as this idealistic kind of idea of democracy. So it's like, what tradition are you looking at? But Giacometti was too young to truly be a futurist, but old enough that he was actually included in the last futurist exhibition. Remember the philosophy of the Italian futurists. They loved the idea of war. They thought war was a hygiene to cure the ills of society and for Italy to again reassert its dominance on the world stage and become again the imperial Rome and spread throughout Europe. Giacometti disagreed. Giacometti also felt, he was part of the Surrealist movement, he felt like his work couldn't be futuristic. He felt like his work couldn't be surrealistic. It had to deal with reason. It had to deal with, how do we grapple as existentialism What does it mean to exist? What do we look at? And he talks about returning to the figure in a real way, in an observational way, even though they are distorted. He says this about wanting to start new, looking at the figure. So it's traditions, but it's not traditional. I began to work from memory, but wanting to create from memory what I had seen. To my terror, the sculptures became smaller and smaller. They had a likeness only when they were small, yet their dimensions revolted me, and I began again, only to end several months later at that same point. A large figure seemed to me false, and a small one equally unbearable. And then often they became so tiny that with one touch of the knife, they disappeared into dust. So he talks about the head and the figure representing a truth, but they couldn't look true to life. He felt like he only found a way to deal with this post-war sort of apocalyptic landscape. Think about the bomb, the atomic bomb. There's a sense of tactility. Here we literally see a head on a pike. This is head of a man on a rod. It's a human head tilted back, mouth agape, screaming and impaled on a metal rod. The violence that's present in this is definitely dealing with the reality of Italy post World War II. It's typical of an artist post-war, but also anti-war statement. You can see the sense of tactility, the materials that he's using. So think about it this way. Bronze doesn't just, you just don't make something with bronze. You have to create something first. If you make something in the lost wax process, essentially what you have to do is you have to sculpt something first out of clay, usually. And then you build a form around that clay with first applying a tiny layer of wax to that clay core. Then you encase it in more clay or wood or plaster, and then you pour metal into that huge form. And what happens is the molten metal, the bronze in this case, melts out the wax falls out of the bottom, the mold gets filled with that molten bronze, it hardens, you take it apart, and then boom, you have a hollow bronze sculpture, right? And so what he's doing with the materials is reflecting sort of the post-apocalyptic landscape of literally Italy, literally of Europe, and this tradition, right? So the threat of now we have the atomic bomb and we could wipe out man with just one single push of a button. So it's kind of this post-human, post-apocalyptic future that he is representing with his work, but still based on tradition. This is called Chariot. That is something that he would have been surrounded with Italian history, seeing these great, huge, monumental sculptures dedicated to the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic, of charioteers, you know, thinking about gladiators, thinking about the Colosseum. There are, in Italy, there's a huge building, the Monument to Emmanuel II, and on the top are these chariots led by horses with charioteers on them. That's kind of the Italian reality, but here he is taking them and stretching them, elongating them, almost imagining the elasticity, the vulnerability of a figure. The figure can't be the same, and he showed that tactile process is very evident of his hand, his thumb, his modeling that clay originally that then gets replaced by the metal. Now remember, he talked about that struggle of making his work smaller and smaller still till it felt right. The chariot in this case is just the wheels. You don't see the horse, but the figure becomes tiny, really, really elongated. Now this work isn't small, it's 6 feet tall, but the figure is exaggerated in such a way that it seems impossible. But it relates to the enormity of the situation, the gravity of post-World War II, the threat of the atomic bomb and our place in the world as being, in a way, frail and helpless and hopeless. This relates to as existentialism. What does it mean to now exist? How can we be? And I think this is really a poignant, sad reminder of war and art cannot be the same. The book doesn't show this, but his figure drawings are amazing. If you like to draw, you should really look at Giacometti's drawings because he really searched. He would continue to layer and layer over, trying to find that space, both through observation, seeing the figure, but also from memory. Kind of like making a mark, erasing it, or layering and changing it and making a new mark over top of it. And then that cumulative effect of all of those marks really give you a sense of space, kind of in the tradition of Cubism, but this is a much more organic and felt sense of space and perspective. Another artist that's really interesting and very isolated is the old artist Balthus. Balthus is his nickname. He was actually grew up in a very wealthy family. He's Polish, but he lived and raised by this distinguished Polish wealthy family in Paris, also in Geneva and Berlin. His real name is Balthasar, but he went by Balthus. He settled in Paris in the 20s, and then as a result of the war, started to make work that he said was just very, very innocent. Mostly pubescent girls, young girls, and they're somewhat unsettling. And I think today, when we look at them, we think about them from a modern perspective, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that whatsoever. But perhaps Balthus didn't have as much baggage of seeing these, in a way, young teenage girls in a sexual way as saying, like, look at what the war did. We lost our collective innocence, right? And he was kind of a recluse. He was a reclusive, raised wealthy, moved around because of the war. But instead of surrealism showing us dreams that don't make sense, that become way too dense and curious and esoteric to really understand, like Salvador Dali, right? For him, that is too hard to kind of understand. He boiled that sexuality down to a sense of innocence and loss of innocence. So this is called the golden days, and here we see perhaps her father at a fire. She's sitting there reclined, similar to like Venus from Manet's Olympia, but she's also kind of looking at herself one last time and making this transition from childhood to adulthood and this kind of loss of innocence. You know, I think it's difficult. There's kind of a sexual unsettling to his work. A lot of times there's young girls looking up their skirts, seeing their panties, and it's hard not to look at it as this sort of creepy old man, kind of pervy vibe of Balthus looking at these girls. But you have to question, is it Balthus the artist desiring this, or is he really truly trying to show us something about our collective selves and about this innocence? But it's unsettling. It's youth sexuality. It's the loss of innocence as well because of during the war and also post-war as well. There is a new movement of artists, and Jean Dubuffet is one of the earliest practitioners of this. It's known as art informal, and the idea is that art becomes a lot purer, in a sense raw, and he called this art brut, and art brut means raw art. Jean Dubuffet he started being trained in a traditional way in an academy, but later just did drawings and paintings privately, and he came upon this book that was published by a doctor in 1922 called The Artistry of the Mentally Ill. And he was really interested in the sort of primacy and urgency, the rawness of these drawings and paintings and sculptures made by the mentally ill. And Dubuffet wrote, "There is only one way to paint well, while there are 1,000 ways to paint badly. They are what I'm curious about. It's from them that I expect something new, that I hope for revelations." It's this kind of, again, similar to Giacometti, a post-war way of rendering the figure, built on tradition, similar to de Kooning. Willem de Kooning, remember, had the painting of the woman that's both Venus and Marilyn Monroe, celebrity, and also like Venus of Willendorf, like these primitive art modes. Jean Dubuffet in this piece, drawing like a child, but also referencing the walls of Paris with their accumulation of textures as posters get tacked up, tore off, scratched into the layer. And he created something that he called haute pâte, like haute couture. Like haute pâte means a thick ground made of sand and earth and fixative and plaster that could be molded and scratched into it, similar to a wall, the graffiti, a very powerful material. So he's really using the medium to give you a texture, a sense of skin. This is almost like a figure that's been splayed, or a figure perhaps that's been run over by a steamroller. And now he calls it a woman, a dame, but it's almost cartoony and hard to define. Here's the arms, but are these also the arms and legs here? And he said, it's okay. He said, gone are the times of showing women as ideal Greek beauty. He said, it pleases me to protest against this aesthetic, the aesthetic of women on magazine covers, this idea of beauty inherited from the Greeks. And he said, I find this miserable and depressing. Surely I am for a beauty. This is beautiful, but not that one, i.e. the one on magazine covers, or the one, thinking about Vogue or Time magazine. Instead, it's a new reimagining of what beauty is. This might not be everyone's cup of tea. His work is challenging and difficult to engage with, but there is a beauty there. It's something that is felt. It is something that's very tactile. And when you see these pieces in person, you almost want to rub your hands across them as well. You can see an emphasis on artists that are, breaking with convention, like Picasso. But maybe sometimes you see just enough of tradition in it that you get it, right? A little bit of tradition with Picasso, a little bit of innovation, but maybe this is a bridge too far. Maybe this is going too far and it's all entirely too new. But think about it. He's searching for a sense of innocence and primacy. And here we see it with the artistry. This is from illustrations from the book by that doctor in 1922, Artistry of the Mentally Ill. And there's something there that's being expressed, the rawness, the innocence of these mentally ill patients who are doing artwork like this. And Picasso and Dubuffet are relating to those works as there's some sort of art brut or raw art where you can kind of tap into the primitive or the naive, or literally anyone. No one has to learn how to draw to be able to draw a figure, right? Like he said, there's thousands of wrong ways to draw some, but in a traditional sense of an academic, there's only one way. It's like you keep drawing. Remember all those guys gathered around that nude male to draw it right. Here's the wrong way to draw, but maybe there's something right. Maybe he gets something right about drawing it wrong in the academic sense, right? And it relates to the landscape, this post-apocalyptic landscape, just like Giacometti is dealing with a new landscape, new figure. This is a German, Hans Hartung, who had fled during World War II, a Nazi oppression, and he settled in Paris. He lived in Spain for a little bit. His work is very free. It's very indebted to abstract expressionism of the United States as well. Artists like de Kooning and Franz Klein. But really, really beautiful. In the late 40s, he developed this mature style of really graphic structures, usually black marks on a colorful background, like slashing at the canvas, scratching. He said he felt imprisoned. He felt like he was digging his way out, and these are personal attacking that he was acting out on the canvas, as he said, out of a desire to record the trace of the personal gesture. And in a way, it's similar to action painting like Jackson Pollock, but Jackson Pollock is doing something free and fluid and gives a sense of the new. Here we get a sense of a void, a negativity, an angst, as existentialism is definitely in his work. So maybe you could recognize something. Maybe you could recognize an object in this, but really it's more of a fleeting feeling that he's trying to represent, a visual experience akin to Rothko and seeing the work. A really interesting, unique, singular artist is a Parisian artist. So she lives in Paris, but she had been born in Lisbon, in Portugal. Maria Helena Vieira da Silva. She's got like one too many names. Brilliant artist. She was really interested in perspective versus decorative space. And you can see that in this piece called The Invisible Stroller. I love her work. It's really interesting, but it's just like it's plucked out of nowhere. But we can see evidence of, as existentialism, kind of feeling maybe like trapped or confused in this dreamlike state of where do I go? How do I escape this space? Like an escape room. It's like a puzzle. You have to figure out how to get out of here. And work after work, she has this sense of both depth, but also flattened out architectural space. I think one great way of summing up her work is truly dazzling. When I look at these paintings in person, which they are huge, they're like mural-sized paintings on canvas, sometimes 6 foot, 10 foot, 14 feet large. And the surface is just dazzling, like a disco ball. It's glimmering and it catches the light. She's really interested in contrast, but it's like a flattened out, unrealistic space. So trying to deal with kind of unpacking and figuring out what's going on. Here's another piece called The Corridor. And we'll see a correlation with Henry Moore that also shows a tunnel where people were hiding out during bombs, during air raids in London, right? So this is something that perhaps alienates us. You know, think about the painting The Scream by Edvard Munch. It has the bridge, it has two figures, it has the violent landscape in the background, and it has the figure, the scream. Imagine if that same space had no figures in it, and it was still called The Scream. It would still pack a lot of intensity and agony and tension, right? Where you feel a sense of the scream without having to see the figure. When I see Maria Helena Vieira da Silva's work, I see a sense of the figure that's there, almost like people walking through this space, shadows cast on the wall. There's an indication of the figure that's felt but not seen. And that's why I think they're brilliant, but hard to place. If someone says, how does this relate to the war? I'm maybe hard pressed. Or what art movement does this become part of? I have no idea. It's not quite abstract expressionism because it's not completely flat. It isn't, cubism because it's not just trying to show us, one thing from multiple perspectives. It's really an unusual, singular vision, very unique vision, but an important one. It's just kind of this synthetic perspective that really relies on us, kind of a suspension of disbelief, similar to watching a film. Okay, she's made a space. I'm going to trust her that this is a space and that I could walk through it. What does this mean? How does this make me feel, right? Another artist that really plays on tradition is Giorgio Morandi, another Italian artist, just like Giacometti. Giacometti becomes huge for sculpture in Italy, and Giorgio Morandi, after World War II, becomes the Italian painter. And he has enough of kind of new developments, but also kind of old world Italian glory. He had a very long career, and it's sort of the escapism, I feel like, of the war. Remember, you're either dealing directly with the war or you're kind of walking away from it. His work is beautiful, quiet, still, beautiful, reflective moments of mostly still lifes. His entire career, he focused on still life paintings. So he was, he knew, he's in Italy, he knew the works of De Chirico and this idea of metaphysical art, which later becomes surrealist art. But instead of recreating nature, he's just mimicking nature. And so you get a sense of the metaphysical or the surrealist, but it's by looking at the actual objects. There's a certain vibration that you get. Really, really well organized. His studio, he lived his almost entire career in Bologna, where he taught. He lived with his mom and his sisters. He was reclusive. He taught. He was a professor of art, taught painting, and his paintings in his own lifetime fetched really high prices. So he was appreciated in his own lifetime. They've recreated his studio, which was in his apartment. The story goes, it's somewhat of a mythic story, so it isn't necessarily entirely based on truth, but that he chased a woman that he loved after the war, and it was an unrequited love, and he said, I give up, I failed this idea of romantic love, and he becomes like, aromantic or asexual, and just chooses to live with his mom and his sisters. In a way, painting becomes his true love, right? This is the story that's been told about Morandi, and it makes a lot of sense. He becomes like a monk. His apartment becomes like a monastery. These become like friends of his, these still life objects that he uses over and over again. There's a story of like someone one time trying to clean off some of the dust, and he said, whoa, 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 that's part of the painting for me, is to see dust accumulating on these objects, and he paints the dust. A sense of brilliant color, but really subdued, a kind of a pastel, palette that he uses. I love the work of Morandi. I think it's beautiful. I think it's brilliant. It's very sculptural, and it's simple. It's subtle. I mean, I'm an abstract artist, but a lot of the work that I like is still figurative, or this is just still life. In drawing class, I'll have students do bottle drawings. Ashlyn was just in drawing. She had Ian, but y'all probably drew from bottles for a while, right? And drawing one, maybe a little bit in drawing two. A still life is just a traditional way of learning how to draw and paint. And usually after about 2 or 3 weeks of drawing these bottles, students are like, okay, damn it, let's move on. Let's draw, give me the good stuff. Let's draw something else. But Morandi did it literally for 60 years, nothing but painting objects like these. And he makes them, I feel like, into landscape paintings. I feel like they become, skyscapes of architecture, but they're really just different ways of looking at the same things. Really, really sparse, spare, humble arrangements that talk about the spiritual as opposed to the material. And I think that's what the beauty of it is. There's a sense of transcendentalism or existentialism that exists in this world of Morandi. Seeing a Morandi painting in person also is a different experience. I think it's like a Rothko painting. I mean, if you look at this and just take one small little area, maybe that's why I like it so much. It's essentially an abstract painting. I mean, this right here is an abstract painting. This right here, this is a little composition. And it's just these singular quiet moments and reflective, right? I can see so much, even though he's given us so little. And look at what he does with color, which I also think is brilliant. This color here, if you're kind of thinking about it from a color theory perspective. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. This color right here in the background is almost identical to this color and this color, but yet he's made them do 3 different things to make us think about background, middle ground, and foreground to create a sense of space. And then think about the vibrancy, the contrast between here, and then adding the complement to give us a sense of layering and space here. Doing a lot with very, very little. Now you might just look at this and say, it's just a still life painting, but look closer. I always think with art, the more you look, the more you're going to see and appreciate. Appreciate doesn't necessarily mean like. I can appreciate something without loving it or wanting to live with it. But Morandi's work, I think, transcends the simplicity and takes me somewhere else. These works are haunting and they stick with you. It's sort of like the object, the material, and the immaterial. It's the object and it's the void. It's the space between. Another Italian artist, similar to Giacometti, that's very, very famous for sculpture and building on tradition. Think about it. You're growing up in Italy. You see the Colosseum. You see, statues of emperors just lining the streets in Rome. You see fragments of early archaic Greek and Roman sculpture just literally out and about in the streets and in museums. It's surrounding you. So Marini is finishing this tradition of Italian art and the legacy of sculpture. His work is very, very heroic, but at the same time, there's a sense of vulnerability. It's like this, and think also about the equestrian monument, like the sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, for instance, right? That heroic emperor on the horse is very common even today. I grew up in Monroe, Michigan. Boom, it's right there. Detroit's there. Ann Arbor, Lansing, Flint. Michigan, the only state that can give you a high five. And in Monroe, Michigan, General Custer had lived there. And in the middle of Monroe, Michigan, there is an equestrian monument dedicated to Custer on horseback. And it's like Custer, larger than life, heroic. There's actually a campaign right now that people want that statue removed because of what he did to indigenous Native Americans in the Battle of Bighorn. Or think about so many of the Southern monuments to the Civil War and the Confederate monuments of figures on horseback. It's this heroic figure, but yet Marini turns that on its head. Who is truly the hero here? He has this figure that looks like it's comically about to fall off of the horse. There's tradition, but it's non-traditional. There is sculpture traditions. He's using the conventions of bronze, of materials, to show a sense of grandeur, but there's also a comical sense in his work too, which I love. I think it's brilliant. This is a great piece by Mario, aka Marini, and this to me is just like wee. It's like I'm king of the world. You see his little wee here, like that's an extension of the horse. They're kind of like they're just feeling young and free, and it's like the anti-equestrian monument. It's like what you wouldn't expect to see of General Custer or General Lee or Ulysses Grant or Marcus Aurelius. He's got his little phallic monument here with an erection. And he's just like no care in the world, and the horse itself is phallic. I mean, the horse is always phallic, but he exaggerates it here, and you can't help but equate the masculinity that is implied with all of these equestrian monuments, right? And so he's exaggerating that. He's like, I'll give you masculine. It's maximum masculine, but it's funny, it's comical, and it's also like vulnerable in a way. Like this is not what you'd expect to see an equestrian monument, and it's tortured. This to me too looks similar to the horse that's splayed in Guernica by Picasso, right? I can't help but think about that horse that's been victimized in Guernica in 1937. Trying to quickly find it here. 1 second. It's worth it. What do you think when you see this sculpture by Marini? How does it make you feel? I think it's humorous, but also tragic at the same time. Is this too dissimilar? Right? Guernica, he'd have been well aware of this. Look at the horse here in Guernica. We see this kind of anguish as well, the heroic versus the anguish. And it's tradition, but it's non-traditional. It's also humorous, and it's kind of that idea of existentialism as well. What does it mean to exist? How do we exist? How do we take what we experience now? Do we have hope? Do we have fear? Do we have anguish? Is it all of those things wrapped into surviving the war? Think about this too, about how many people died as a result of World War II, how many millions of Jews were killed during the Holocaust. There's a sense of survivor's remorse and guilt, like success, like I made it, but at the same time, a remorse that my friends, my family, my neighbors did not make it. And we can see that in a sense of Marini's sculptures. There's also a group of artists that work with this idea of let's begin new, let's begin again, let's start something new. This is an Argentinian artist who was trained in Italy, Lucio Fontana. His work, I think, is brilliant. He created, basically he rejected the spatial illusion. He didn't want art of the Renaissance, and he's relating to art that he sees in Italy, trained as a sculptor, and instead he wants to create a new sense of space. And his art he called spatialism. So instead of having an illusionistic space of a figure and a background and deep space, this kind of hierarchy that we saw in Jacques-Louis David's work, or looking at the Renaissance, naturalistic illusion of atmospheric perspective, or linear perspective, or aerial perspective, he's giving us a new space. And look at the title here. He had these series of paintings that were egg-shaped canvases called spatial concepts. And in this one in particular, it's called Spatial Concept, the End of God. It's a questioning of existentialism. What does it mean to be? Who do I trust? Can I trust my neighbor? Can I trust my government? Can I trust God? Does God exist? What does it mean to exist, right? We could call this abstract, but it is also a sense of the real, because it has two layers. There's two layers of canvas, one orange, one green, and as he pokes violently through that green canvas, the orange reveals itself. So it's kind of creation and destruction. In a sense, it's not the end of God, it's the beginning of life. It is the egg, right? It is God creating, but also taking something away. It's this preconceived notion of what art is or should be. Instead, it's what art could be. And I love that about his work. I get it. It seems easy. It seems simple. Anyone could do this. My kid could do this. Yeah, probably. Or I was at Hobby Lobby one time and I saw there was a canvas that apparently probably someone was cutting open a box of canvases and he went too far with their knife and it had a big old split through it. Took a photo and was like, there's a Lucio Fontana at Hobby Lobby. And that canvas, now they wouldn't be able to sell it for $20 because it's worthless. But in a sense, Lucio Fontana would turn that into gold. This is now the artistic gesture. It's really about process too. So in a way, this is like abstract expressionist action painting because the process is as important as the end result. But I think that given that though too, it is still very artistic. It isn't just like he went to town just stabbing the heck out of this canvas. They feel very artfully to me and intentionally arranged, that there's sort of a pattern. It's not haphazard. And he called these buchi, or which is Italian for holes. And this was his gesture. He's experimenting with materials. This is traditional, right? It is, well, it's based on tradition, It's tradition, but it's non-traditional. It's canvas, it's paint. Hell, that's a painting. But he's really exploring, and if you think about it, making a connection. Paint, what can a painting be? I exist. What is the meaning of existing? So really this is existentialism. Really this is about the process of being. You know, I saw this really interesting exhibition when I was in Rome, and it showed side-by-side juxtapositions of artists like Lucio Fontana with artists like Canaletto, or next to artists like Raphael. And in really, when you think about it, those are so different, but at the same time, they're still exploring the same ideas: space, perspective, color, and harmony. It's just a new way of using those materials. And by saying the end of God, it's sort of saying like the end of painting, but I think it's just the beginning. I look at this and I think that this is giving future artists the sense of anything is possible, right? You've made something new, you've made something possible. That doesn't mean like you've completely forgotten everything that came before it, right? That doesn't say that the Raphael painting that was next to this is no longer valid. It's saying that's real, this is real, and anything is possible. What are you going to make? What are you going to contribute? What do you contribute to the history of art? And this is Lucio Fontana's contribution, which is a rejection of spatial illusion, but still using the medium of painting. I think it's brilliant. Here's another one of his pieces, right? Very, very simple. And it's literally the landscape was toured. Literally the landscape of Italy, of Germany was cut, bombed, torn apart. It was still in ruins. It took decades to be able to rebuild churches, Gothic churches, that they literally had to put back together brick by brick, stone by stone, recreate and rebuilding. And you can see that sense of rebuilding as well in these paintings. There's this art that I talked about, art informal, which is like more informal art. And Alberto Burri is also an Italian artist. He was a doctor in the Italian army, and he saw tragedy after tragedy in North Africa where he was stationed. He was captured by the British and later turned over to the Americans, where he was a war criminal and prisoner in Texas. And as sort of art therapy, he started to draw and paint. He left medicine. He didn't want to heal people anymore after he saw the nastiness of World War II in North Africa, the campaign there. And he began to use creativity as a way of freeing himself. He didn't worry about artistic training. He just did juxtapositions. And this is called composition. And it's different sacks and fabrics and burlap stitched together with paint literally splashed on it. Similar to action painting, abstract expressionism. So he would have seen that in the United States. When he goes back to Europe in Rome and he has exhibitions again, you can almost imagine that this is the bandages on the soldier's arm after he treats their wound, or us trying to put the pieces back together, and it's futile because they're never going to go back together the same way. It's like entropy. It's like existentialism. If you think about, the idea of entropy, if you had black sand over here and you had white sand over here, and you took and you spun those all together, yes, you get gray sand, which is something entirely new and different, but you'll never be able to go back again to black sand over here and white sand over here. When I look at the work of Alberto Burri, that's what I see. He did really interesting experimental works as well. One of the first artists to use fire as an element, and some of you did the artist that used fireworks in your review, your movie work of Guao Kang. And Alberto Burri was one of the first to use fire. He would burn wood, he would burn plastic, and whatever the fire did, that became the piece. So in a way, it's kind of like abstract expressionism, action painting, where the process, in a sense, is just as important, if not more important, than the end result. But it's also art informal. like Art Brut, Jean Dubuffet, Alberto Burri, and this next group that we're going to talk about, Antio Tapies was also part of. So as a Spanish artist, he was aware of the devastation of the Spanish Civil War. He was also a member of this loose idea of art informal, which is just kind of informal art. It's art that isn't tradition. You don't have to be taught the right way to make art. It's kind of art brut, raw art. And this looks like the ground. This is a painting collage, as he called it. It's mixed media on canvas. Again, similar to Alberto Burri, it would have canvas in it, sand, dirt, fire, glass, shards in it. Really thick, rough textures. He really built up the surfaces of his paintings, combining different varnishes and sand, powdered marble, to create this really textural relief. It's almost like Pollock that took the painting off the wall and applied it to the ground to work. Well, here Tapies is literally giving us the ground and applying it to the wall in a very artistic way. Again, an idea to show the reality of the damage done by his fellow Spaniards during the war years. And he said about his work, it seemed to inscribe themselves on the walls around me. And it's interesting because his name, Tapies, in fact, is a form of the verb tapiar, which means to wall something in. In a way, he's walled in. Tapies used poor materials, everyday materials, wood, rope, canvas, cardboard, burlap, found objects to create a sense of what the world looked like. Spiritual, but transformational. Existentialism. What does it mean to exist? And now with our surroundings around us. This looks like war footage of World War II, of what it looked like in a bunker, right? Or now a village that's been decimated and reduced to rubble, right? He's walling us in, a sense of feeling trapped. Another group of these art informal artists is the Cobra artists. It's a moniker, it's a name that they gave themselves as a distance between where they lived. So Cobra literally stands for, the CO is Copenhagen, the BR is Brussels, and the A is Amsterdam. So that's why they're capitalized, the C, the B, and the A. Copenhagen in Denmark, Brussels in Belgium, and Amsterdam in the Netherlands, which forms a triangle and isn't too far apart. It's not too difficult to visit those. It's a naive style. It's a style like Dubuffet's Art Brut. You don't have to be trained to do this, although the artist said that this artist here, Carol Appel, said that just like Picasso was inspired by young artists' drawings or learning to draw like a child, like I drew the right way and then I had to unlearn it and draw like a child again. Or similar to Dubuffet with Art Brut, who was looking at the drawings of children and those that were in mental health institutions. And Carol Appel said this about art. You have to learn it all, he said, then forget it and start again like a child. There is this inner evolution. And so in a way, it seems like there's a lack of control over the process, but there's complete control. There's a freedom like abstract expressionism, but they didn't want to strip entirely devoid of character and figure. So this is the enigma of frozen water. You can see there are figurative elements. This is a figure right here. There's a face when you see it. Eyes, nose, mouth, hands outstretched, kind of dripping and oozing and melting. Here's another face. Here's another face. Here's another face here. Asger Jorn, aka Asger Jorn, is when I did an artist residency in Belgium, and I met a really great artist there, Torsten Dennerlein. We're friends. He's a printmaker. We both did a residency at the Frans Mazerl Center in Belgium. And while we were there, we would work every day from sun up to sundown when the studio was open Monday through Friday. But it was always closed on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, which was perfect because then it was just a short hop on a train to go to Brussels or to go to Bruges, which we did, or Ghent, and see the museums there. And Torsten and I were walking through the museum together, and we were asking each other what we felt about different pieces. That's what one does when you're with an artist. You'll say yay or nay, like, no, this piece sucks, or I really, really dig this piece. And we came up on Asger Jorn's work, and I said, you know, a lot of people don't get it, but I see it. It makes sense for the times. Even though this is 1970, he really started what he was doing in the late 40s, mid 50s, right? They started in 1948 and they really hit their strides in the 1950s. And I said, not many people see it or get it now, but I said, you know, I remember saying to him, like, I love it, I get it, because it completely makes sense for like the late 1940s, post World War II, and the 1950s, trying to figure out a new way of art. And I was like, we saw an Asger Jorn piece, and I was like, I really dig this one. He's like, it's my grandfather. He's like the grandson of Asger Jorn, which I thought was just really, really cool. And I'm like, thought to myself, good thing I didn't say it sucked, right? Like, this piece is terrible. And it's interesting to see, and he intentionally chose to take his mother's maiden name as opposed to his dad's name, because that's his grandfather, and he didn't want to be Torsten Jorn and have that legacy of trying to follow in his footsteps. But he was still really, really proud of what his grandfather accomplished as an artist. He was really influential in his life and his career. But pretty cool. So a loose association of these artists that are exploring the naivete, the innocence, and the loss of innocence because of World War II. This is a Dutch artist, Karel Appel, who actually, even though it was illegal, he publicly tried to save Dutch Jews from deportation during the war. So in other words, if you were Dutch, you know, you had to turn in Jews. And, you know, he was from Amsterdam, and he lived, Karel Appel lived in Amsterdam, same place where Anne Frank lived. And think about this, Anne Frank hid in an attic, right? If you were not Jewish, if you were Dutch, or if you were German stationed in the Netherlands, you had to turn over anyone that you knew was Jewish, and they were then deported to Germany or Austria, sent first to working camps and then later concentration camps. He very publicly fought to save Dutch Jews. Karel Appel did, and he was in some ways successful, and he didn't sway many minds in the 1930s in terms of a public way, and then so he moved from a public campaign to try to save Dutch Jews, and then moved to a very private way of saving. He later moves to Paris, and then after the war moves back to Amsterdam, and had a certain pride of being Dutch and from the Netherlands, but a sense of anger, of being jaded, angst that you can see, a new way. He's that artist that says you have to forget it all and start anew. He learned to paint. He knows how to paint. Karel Appel could paint circles around me or anyone. But this is how he chooses to paint. And it's still a right way of painting. Remember what Dubuffet said, right? There's so many wrong ways to paint. There's only one good way, and there's thousands of bad ways. The bad ways are what interest me. Same with the Cobra artist. There's another Belgian, Pierre Elchinski. But an interesting group, because Cobra, standing for their locations, philosophically also aligns themselves as a very anti-war sentiment, which then in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s was inspirational to give African Americans and black artists a sense of pride from where they were, where they came from, and they could then the same energy use to point out wrongs, to try to right wrongs, right? So Cobra then becomes a moniker for black artists in the United States, an unlikely alliance of artists. But one artist, Jeff Donaldson, who we'll talk about this semester, is from Arkansas. He co-founded Afra Cobra. He wanted to create a new sense of this geographical alliance. He moved to Chicago, and a sense of a rallying call of, in a sense, the paintings aren't about morality, but you know, physically or visually or conceptually, they're not about morality. But as a group, they are very, very moral, a sense of what is right. If you think about as existentialism, it's not trusting that humans have in them a certain amount of good or a certain amount of evil. There's no kind of strict good versus evil. There's always slippage. There's a lot of gray area that people saw directly. They saw the worst in themselves. They saw the worst in their neighbors. They saw the worst in their government as a result of the tragedies of World War II. This is interesting. This is an artist that was Austrian, lived in Germany, was Jewish, and had to pretend to be German to survive, and was able to survive. And he was a self-taught artist, Hundertwasser, and he is kind of seen as an outsider artist, but made many, many works. Very, very prolific over the course of his lifetime, very prolific. And this piece is called House, which was born in Stockholm, died in Paris, and myself mourning it. He was really also a self-taught architect. His work is just brilliant. Look at the building in the background, and this is the house that was born in Stockholm, died in Paris, and him mourning it. And if you look at Hundertwasser's architecture, it's worth a Google. Beautiful stuff in the tradition of Art Nouveau, but here he is making work that's really bright and colorful and atypical of what you would see as mourning. Right? This is supposed to be depressed, but is beautiful, unexpected. Also unexpected in terms of art because it doesn't have to be effective. It doesn't have to be about technical acuity, how well you paint something. Instead, it can be how you envision it and being creative. I'm going to show you the Hundertwasser house, which is beautiful. This is unreal. You're not going to believe this place. This is in Vienna. The Hundertwasser house. He was an informal artist, an informal architect as well, and kind of in the Art Nouveau tradition. Austrians, Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, he's in that same tradition, right? So there's the sense of continuing Art Nouveau. And Paul Klee, these are all artists that he's inspired by. A British sculptor, two British sculptors that are super important post-World War II. One we've already talked about, Henry Moore, who becomes Sir Henry Moore, and Barbara Hepworth. They were both friends, colleagues. They went to the same school, Leeds School of Art. And you know how you can be Sir Henry Moore and become knighted? Well, there's the same thing for women in England, and she is Dame Barbara Hepworth. So she has that same equivalency of being knighted, but the male equivalent of a Sir is a dame, kind of being knighted or sainted. And her work is really interesting because it's about mass. It's about mass in space and really beautiful groupings and abstraction. She becomes world famous, one of the first female sculptors to become world famous. And you think about like Louise Bourgeois and Louise Nevelson in abstract expressionism, Barbara Hepworth got there first and also became more famous, world famous. And her work is just beautiful and elegant. And a lot of times people think about sculpture as being a very masculine thing because it's working construction and materials and heavy materials. And she fights that kind of preconceived notion. And there's a kind of sense of both masculine and femininity and elegance and grace alongside that sense of strength and solidity. And like I mentioned, she was good friends with Henry Moore. They were colleagues. They both went to Leeds. They both become world famous. This is, his work, he said he never felt like he was making work that was about existentialism. His work was more escapism, which we can see here. But he served in World War I, Henry Moore. We talked about him before. His works were surrealist, influenced by the Schockmühls, the Mayan art Schockmühls, those reclining figures that had the libation, ceremonial bowls that were originally on them, and he did these kind of abstracted versions of those. But he also was impacted by World War I and World War II. So this is a study for a tube shelter, and it's all about perspective. Think about during World War II and during the raids, the air raids, when there's the threat of bombing or when there is mass bombings of, Churchill said, they're going to have to bomb us to submission, and Nazis practically did that, and they barely survived. They had to eke out an existence that was mostly underground as much as it was above ground. And so this was showing the reality of air raids. And even though he says it's not about his existentialism and it's all about formalism and just seeing, observing what's there, you can't help but relate it to as existentialism. He was gassed very early on in World War I, so he suffered with that the rest of his life, but still was able to transcend. He felt his work was transformational and transcendent. He does say that those empty subway tubes, those platforms where people had to hide in the train tunnels, he said those train tunnels seemed to be like the holes in my sculptures, the voids. So you couldn't help, even when you weren't trying to make work about the war, because he didn't want to, it's still there, right? One of the most brilliant, singular, unique artists of the 20th century is the artist Francis Bacon, who is self-taught. He's an Irish artist that moves to England, mostly associated as being British, completely self-taught. He wanted to make work that was horrific, and some writers have described his work as really fitting in a tradition of the sublime. And sublime means something that's transcendent, that's both horrific and beautiful at the same time. You can really see that. You cannot separate Francis Bacon's work from the reality of war in Europe and the brutality of it. His paintings are about meat, are about flesh, are about agony and screaming again and again, a sense of suffering and torture, sadistic actions of outsiders, usually that we don't see, acting upon a inner subject matter or protagonist that's inside of the painting. There's sort of like us, and there's these outside forces. He said this original painting is where he got the idea for these suspended carcasses of meat. It didn't matter if he was like a butcher when he was painting, because he felt like the war was a butcher and life is like a butcher. And if you're thinking about existentialism, there is no greater metaphor than thinking about flesh as meat. It's saying, do we exist, or are we meat, or are we actually bodies, right? There's a difference. Are we a carcass, or are we a person that's embedded with an internal purpose and struggle and meaning? It's all about existentialism. You cannot separate out the work of Francis Bacon from the war and the reality of existentialism. It's a brilliant juxtaposition of these ideas, all wrapped singularly in a really unique vision. So he said he started this painting, and it was meant to be something different. It was meant to be a horizon line, and above an umbrella, he wanted to perch a bird. But he noticed that that bird started to look a lot like a hanging carcass. And this inspired the way that he resolved this painting, but all of his painting become, even if they're not about meat or a carcass, you see that sense of death and butcher in his paintings and agony. So he was inspired by Spanish painters like Velázquez and Picasso. You can see an Italian influence as well, like the Renaissance. He studied a lot of artwork by going to museums and looking at them, but wanted to paint a new reality. This is probably one of his most famous paintings. It's called Head 6. It's one that he revisited over and over again. He wanted to make the best painting ever of the human cry, and he conflated the papal image of Velázquez here, Pope Innocent X here, with the Russian film, the battleship Potemkin, and this figure, a close-up of a woman of this ship, the Odessa, who all of a sudden, she's coming out to support the sailors engaged in mutiny against the crew officers. She's been wounded herself in the eye, which you can see, and then she just screams. It's kind of like a protest of the agony of what's happening. And this is this famous, very famous Russian film, this scene, and you can see how it influences this painting here, combined with the Pope. As existentialism, are we religious? Should we be religious? Did God abandon us in World War II? Does God exist? These are the questions of existentialism. These are the questions that many are asking them, including people of great faith. So not just someone that's atheist, but someone that's Christian or Jewish. How do you compromise or how do you resolve your ideas about faith in God if, 6 million Jews had just been wiped out as the result of the Holocaust, if, 3 million Brits were killed in World War II? It's really difficult to be able to grapple with that, right? As existentialism. Francis Bacon was gay, and he was on the eve of one of his big exhibitions. He was going to have a great reception, a grand opening of a big exhibition of his paintings. He achieved world fame, and his lover intentionally OD'd on barbiturates and died. And he paints this in a triptych, in a loving, touching way, but also a horrific way. It's as if he's also this tortured, twisted cadaver, this butchered piece of meat, which we see in his work. But also he wanted to show him like a model on a runway as beautiful. Just interesting because you don't necessarily see that. But it's one of those things, like I say all the time, the more you look, the more you see, and the more you can start to understand and appreciate. If you just see this as a triptych in the tradition of religious paintings like Velázquez or Rubens or Van Eyck, it has an eerie quality to it. You might see this as three separate figures, a before, a during, and an after. But when you start to think about the context of him as a painter achieving fame because of his work, and then the sense of guilt and neglect that he was going to his art opening as opposed to attending to his partner's struggle, right? So there's kind of this sense of victimization and guilt that you can see in this painting. It means one thing to see it, and there's this visual response. I love the harmony and the repetition that gets created by this wall and then the void that the figure is in. This sense of a figure, like a runway model that's on a runway, which it doesn't seem to be there, but once you hear that, it kind of makes sense. He's showing us this as being both beautiful and horrific at the same time. How can that be? But that's something that we grapple with as existentialism. That's something that you grapple with. How can you be proud to be an artist that's achieving world fame at the same time that's suffering at home? And here he tries to attempt to resolve that, right? Beautiful work by Francis Bacon, really, really interesting. Another artist that is British is Lucian Freud. Lucian Freud is the grandson of Sigmund Freud. So he was born in Berlin, but he's a British artist, the heir of, if you think about Freud and psychology, his works are like Freud's investigations into the mind, but Lucian Freud is investigating the inner workings of the mind and the physical outlook with paint. His work is brilliant, becomes one of the best known painters in Great Britain. British artist. The artist whose Jewish family left Berlin for England when Hitler came to power in 1933, they had to escape for their lives. There's a sense also in his work. And the person also that sat for this painting fled Nazi Germany and was British. So there is a compassion for his subject matter. It's unusual, though, is it not? She has one breast revealed and the other one is covered, but it reveals a sense of vulnerability. Also, it was very traditional throughout art history. If you think about the Virgin Mary, oftentimes in paintings would have one breast exposed as a way of showing the quality of her nurturing, becoming the mother of the church, in a way this girl with this white dog becomes nurturing. I think we can relate as a viewer, especially in the 1950s, with her, but we can also relate to the dog. We can also relate to the painter who has struggled with the same things that this person that was portrayed. It's a really devotion to the physical presence of the sitter, but also their inner being, the physical, but also the psychological. And you really see pain when you look at a Lucian Freud work. He really struggles. It's sort of like Giacometti. There's a searching for observation. They're very, very fleshy. Here's another one, Naked Man, back view. I just love this work. And when you see it, it becomes almost abstracted. The painting is almost completely filled with this man's back. And if you just saw that, it's almost abstract. Or the background space is almost abstract. He's as interested in the carpet as he is with the figure itself. We don't see the identity of the figure, but we get a sense of pain and paint, which I just love when I look at Freud's work. I always see, and he talked about it's in the flesh, that you're depicting flesh. It never loses the sense of a living thing, right? And when I look at his work, I always zoom in and just want to get a closer look. It's like Van Gogh. We call that impasto, right? Dubufay's surfaces were really thick, textural. There isn't an artifice anymore. It's all about the artificiality of it. Like Rubens and Raphael and Titian thinly applied paint to kind of create this illusion. If you think about Alberto Burri, Lucio Fontana, if you think about Dubuffet, Tapies, they're showing us the gritty reality, the texture of the city, of life, and it's not an illusion. It is an illusion of a painting, but it doesn't belie its surface. Remember, Picasso said, painting is a truth, is a lie that gets us to the truth. And here Freud is doing the same thing. It's a painting that's a lie that gets us to understand the truth. And when I look at a Freud painting in person, this one is at the Met, and I saw this, and this is a close-up that I took. Okay, so this is my photo. Because when I look at his work, and you can see the lighting is different. When I look at a Freud painting, I look at sections, I look at little pieces, and just you can understand the pain and you can understand the paint. When we talk about Van Gogh, we think about Van Gogh's paintings as much a self-portrait as they are portraits. Even a painting like Starry Night, or one of his sunflowers, or crows flying above a wheat field might not have any indication of a person in them, but we can feel the presence of a person in them, and they become self-portraits of the inner turmoil of Van Gogh. And I see that in Freud as well. When I see this foot, and this is my photo, just zoomed in, I took this at the Met when I was there 2 summers ago. I was just struck by this. I didn't even know at the time that I would necessarily use it or teach it, but I was just like, look at this, because I understand Freud looking at this foot. Somehow, I don't know. I know that sounds weird. I know that doesn't necessarily make the most amount of sense, but trust me, if you take yourself on the same journey of understanding who Sigmund Freud was, right, and how wacky he was, and how some people took what he said as gospel, and now a lot of psychologists have worked very, very hard to debunk what Sigmund Freud actually said. Think about who Lucian Freud was, and who his sitters oftentimes were people that had to flee for their lives. And when I think about that, I can't think of a better metaphor than seeing it actually in the flesh, in the paint, the physicality, but also the inner turmoil, the psychological aspect as well. It's a sense of pairing, right? It's loose and it's fleshy, but it's a sense of pairing, that idea of outer, like Francis Bacon, seeing this as just meat, seeing this as just, a mass, a body, but the inner turmoil as well. It's also that idea of existentialism. That's all I got today. Boom, I hope you appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed. That's the last chapter before our test. Enjoy. Y'all got this. Feel free to holler at me. Shoot me an email. Send me a message if you have questions. I know this is me just kind of recording these lectures, but I want this still to feel like a conversation, and I hope you're engaging with the material. Reach out if you have any questions or if you want to have a further discussion about any of these pieces. Peace. See y'all.